everybody. It's Jeffrey Gurian here in New York City, and you are listening to Neil and Nelson on the Nobody's Podcast. Lucky you.
The time has arrived. We've been looking forward to this. The legendary, the incomparable Jeffrey Gurian, everybody. Welcome to the podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you, man. It's good to be here with you guys.
Oh, tremendous.
I love Canada.
Yeah.
I go to Montreal every year for the Just for Laughs Festival, but I went to Toronto as well, and it's such a great city. I didn't go for comedy. I went for the other part of my life. There was an energy psychology conference that they have every year in Toronto.
Oh, well.
And that's something that I'm involved in as well. And I went and I got to experience the city, and it's very cool. So big shout out to all my friends in Toronto.
Right on. Right on. They'll be listening. We'll let them know that.
Cool.
Spend an evening with not only the comic great, but you have so we hear a history in the dental field. So
what came first, the dentist or the comic?
The dental thing was a nasty rumor. And you know when it started?
Okay, when you graduated from...
The day I graduated from dental school, that's right. That's when it started, and it never let up. All these years, and there's still, that rumor persists. It's unbelievable. And you know who started it? My patients. It was just unbelievable how that... It just gets out of hand. But they've accused a lot of people of being dentists. You know, some of the biggest guys in show business, they accused of being dentists. Michael Eisner, you know, people, Jeff Zucker, they're all dentists. I think it has something to do with being Jewish. Oh, yeah. Jewish and dentists, they just, right away, they lump us all together.
I read that you said ever since you were 12, you wanted to be both a dentist and a comic.
Yeah, it was a weird thing, you know. Like, I remember, it's funny, I remember so clearly being 12 years old and trying to decide what I wanted to do in my life. And I had the feeling I wanted to be a doctor of some kind, but I was too sensitive to do anything with, like, life and death. So then I thought I wanted to be an orthodontist because I was going to an orthodontist, and I liked the idea of making people look good.
Right. And
I was already writing comedy. And I thought to myself, I want to do both, but who ever heard of, like, a dentist in show business? How am I going to do that? You know what I mean? And I literally remember having those thoughts, and it was so confusing to me. Like, how am I going to pull that off, you know? And it's so weird that became my life, you know, that I didn't become an orthodontist. I was a specialist in cosmetic dentistry. Oh. But the whole time I was writing comedy for, like, Rodney Dangerfield and Joan Rivers and people like that while I was still in practice.
Mm-hmm. So how did you make that connection or that transition?
How did I make it?
Yeah.
I had no choice, really. It was like I was doing both at the same time. And I realized that if you're going to be in another field and you're going to write comedy, you better write for very famous people, or else it sounds like a joke. Like, I don't know if you guys knew the Ed Sullivan Show,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it was a very popular show in the States, and he would have on, like, very strange acts, like plate spinners and a knife-throwing act. And I'm like, I didn't want to sound like a knife-throwing act, you know what I mean? Like, you know, he does fillings, he writes jokes, he has a tap dancing school. I didn't want to do any of that. I figured, so if people were going to take me seriously, then I better write for, like, very famous people.
Right, right.
So I just geared myself to writing for, like, big stars, and the first big one was Rodney Dangerfield, and, you know, and he was doing my stuff on The Tonight Show. Mm-hmm. But then they would call me at the office, and my nurse had very strict instructions, only disturb me for show business. Nothing else. If I'm with a patient, don't dare disturb me unless it's something in show business. So they would come in and they'd say, excuse me, Dr. Rivers is on the phone, or Dr. Burl is calling, or, you know, Dr. Belzer is on the phone. The only one that no one believed was Dr. Dangerfield.
Really?
That was, you know, no one ever fell for that one, you know, Dr. Dangerfield. But that's what I would do. I would, you know, I would be drilling, and then I would get a call, like, we need a speech. We need some jokes for this or that. You know, I was writing for the Friars Club at the time.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I got a call, it was for the Jim Dale roast back in the 80s, and I was like, they needed me to do it that night. I was like drilling and writing jokes. I would be drilling, and then I'd run to my desk and write down some jokes, and then run back to the chair and then write some more jokes. And it was crazy. And then I had to go to Jim Dale's house and meet with him.
Right.
And it was a very exciting thing. And I was a kid. I didn't care that I was doing all that, all that work. It was just fun for me. It's always been fun.
It's amazing that you're able to do that. When you started, were you submitting your jokes to the agents of these comics, or?
No, you know what I was doing? I was actually going to the clubs. I was meeting people. I got started from the original Saturday Night Live people.
Yeah.
The show was only about a year or two old, and I had been making little films myself on the street, like using a Super 8 camera. And I was filming things like bizarre news. Years later, I had my own column in Weekly World News called Gurian's World of the Bizarre. Uh-huh. And I always liked strange stories, like tap dancing for the criminally insane, and Canadian repairman wakes up with French accent. That's one that I'll tell you guys later, because your Canadian audience will appreciate that. But I was doing stories like several men were arrested for smearing cream cheese on the ankles of elderly women who wore their stockings rolled down like bagels.
Oh, my God.
Now, I don't know if you ever seen if the old women in Canada do that, but in this country, old women would take their stockings and roll them down their legs, and so they'd be around their ankles, and it would look like bagel. It was fucking horrible. I would get nauseous. And so I went to my dear grandmother, and I begged her to let me put cream cheese on her ankles so I could make this film. And she said, Jeffrey, only for you would I do this. And she made believe she had a Jewish accent and that she had just come to this country. And she said, Jewish people, we have two kinds of stockings, one for milk and one for meat. She goes, and this crazy man, he smeared cream cheese on my meat stockings, and I can't get it off. And then I zoom in with the camera on her stockings, and they're rolled down like bagels, and she's got cream cheese on her ankles. So I filmed that, and then I was filming stories like there were two master criminals that I called the Masters of Disguise. And they were master criminals who disguised themselves as inanimate objects to commit their crimes. So it starts out as two men disguised as coats rob a hat store. They come in over the arms of two other men, and they say, just act natural like wear your coats and nobody will get hurt. Right? And so police draw composite drawings of the perpetrators, and it's two coats, And then it expanded to many crimes, like, two men disguised as a pair of eyeglasses rob a local optometrist. They come in on another man's face. And I do an interview with the guy who says, I don't know what's going on. I'm walking into this optometrist. Out of nowhere, another pair of glasses jumps onto my face, and a voice says, just act natural like wear your glasses and nobody will get hurt. What's this city coming to? So I would do many crimes like this, It actually got to the point where 250,000 men disguised as vests rob a suit warehouse. And I interviewed the designer who says, I don't know what happened here. He goes, I can't imagine. And he goes, I went to my warehouse just before I went out to lunch, and I had 250,000 suits there. I go out to lunch, I come back, and wait a minute. And he said, there were 250,000 suits, and every suit had a vest. He goes, I only designed two-piece suits. I didn't make a vest for those suits. 250,000 suits, they all had a vest. He goes, I went out to lunch, I came back, all the suits were gone. It had to be the vests. So now police artists went on strike because they refused to draw all 250,000 vests.
Oh, my God.
So I do these films, and I bring them up to Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
And how I got up there was ridiculous. In those days, there was no security because this was before terrorism. There was no bombs going off in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. You could pull you could pull right up to 30 Rock, because that's where Saturday Night Live comes from. 30 Rockefeller Plaza.
Right.
It's on 49th Street and 5th Avenue for any of you Toronto guys who have been to New York. And it's right in the heart of everything. Mm-hmm. And these days, you can't pull anywhere near the building. But in those days, you could pull up right in front. Now, I was driving a Pimpmobile in those days, which was a car that only pimps drove. It was a car that had been made for one of the Isley brothers. Okay. And I actually got confirmation on that last year, and I'll tell you that story too. It was a Mandarin Orange Eldorado.
Oh my God, Eldorado! I saw one the other day. Actually.
An Eldorado, a 1975 Mandarin Orange Eldorado. It was a boat basically, and I bought the car and I put a Rolls Royce grill on it like the pimps did, and it had big white wall tires and a cabriolet roof, and it had these straps in the back, just like the pimps drove, but mine had doctor's plates on it. So it was very confusing to people.
Yeah, sure.
And so, and I had a CB radio. There were no car phones in those days, but I had a CB radio that was in the shape of a phone. So I pull up to 30 Rock, and I throw the doorman a few dollars, and I said to the guy, watch my car, Lorne Michaels is expecting me.
Oh, wow.
I had a lot of balls in those days. And so he had no reason to doubt me because no one ever saw a white man in a car like that. You know what I mean? All my black friends, they would give me thumbs up on the car. And my wife was like, we're Jewish and we live in Scarsdale. Why am I driving an orange Cadillac? And I'm like, you don't get it. Obviously, you don't get it, you know? And I was playing Superfly tapes, 8-track tapes in those days. I thought that was my aspiration. I wanted to be Superfly. So I pull up to the building and I throw the guy some money and I go inside. He's watching my car for me, and I sneak past security because in those days you could do that. You know, these days they'll shoot at you, but in those days you could just do it. So I snuck into the elevator and I got up to Saturday Night Live, and everybody was kids. It was a new show. Alan Zweibel was there, who has gone on to become an award-winning producer, director, writer, you know, and he was playing handball on the wall with a guy named Neil Levy, who was one of the producers of the show, who I believe was related to Lorne Michaels. And so I introduce myself, and I tell him about my films, and he agrees to look at them. And I kept sneaking into the show, man. I was sending flowers to the receptionist. I just kept getting up there, and they watched my stuff, and Alan liked it enough that he called his manager for me. And his manager was a guy named David Jonas, who was most famous for discovering Freddie Prinze. Not the Freddie Prinze that you know, Freddie Prinze Sr.,
right.
the original, who was on Chico and the Man.
Okay. And no, I didn't think it was the
junior.
Yeah, no,
the junior, right? Yeah, it was the real guy, the real deal, Freddie Prinze, and so he got him Chico and the Man, and so he's the guy that got me started through Alan. He was handling Alan at the time, and this guy was working with comedians. And so it took me about a year to learn how to write a joke because I was doing these silly sketches with, like, you know, cream cheese on the ankles, which is funny because last year I did Robert Kelly's podcast, mm-hmm. and he named the episode Cream Cheese on the Ankles. as, you know, as a thank you, I guess, for me being on and you know, paying tribute to my grandmother, who was so wonderful and so funny. You know, in those Masters of Disguise things, I did one where several men robbed a jewelry store. They came in on the dress of an unsuspecting woman, right? And they robbed this jewelry store, and my grandmother was the woman. And she told her, you know, I would always interview the victim of the crime who would give her account of what happened. And she said, you know, I was looking in a jewelry store window. She said, when suddenly the jewelry that I had on became so heavy that I couldn't stand up anymore. She said, I had to stoop over, and I had to walk like this. And she walked all bent over. And I said to her, when did you realize that these were men and not jewelry? And she said, well, she said, one of the robbers was disguised as a stick pin, right? And she said, I screamed, and a security guard came and wrestled the stick pin to the ground. But unfortunately, he got away. Now, I had to find a security guard who would wrestle with a stick pin. So I went into a bank that was in my neighborhood, and the guy only knew me as a doctor, because that's one of the banks that I would go to during the day. And I had to go in on my lunch hour. So I'm dressed as a doctor, and I'm trying to ask the security guard if he would wrestle with a piece of jewelry. And I started to laugh hysterically. I couldn't control myself. And every time I tried to say, would you wrestle with a stick pin, I couldn't get the word stick pin out because the look in this guy's face was so bizarre. He was looking at me like I was out of my mind because he was saying, yeah, doctor, take it easy. He was going out like, I just want you to wrestle with, and I couldn't get the word out. just having to ask the guy to wrestle with a piece of jewelry was amazing. But I got the film made, and anyway, that's the kind of stuff that I was doing. So that's how I got started writing. But you couldn't do that anymore. There's no way. You can't just sneak in places in New York because they'll throw grenades at you.
What was it like working with Lorne Michaels?
I never worked with Lorne Michaels. I didn't write for Saturday Night Live. I would go up there and I would hang out, and the people on the show, it was, Alan Zweibel arranged for me to meet his manager. Mm-hmm. So I would go up there because I got friendly with different groups as they went on. Like Phil Hartman was a good friend of mine, and I got friendly with John Lovitz and Kevin Nealon, who I still see. When I was out in L.A., I did Kevin Nealon's show at the Laugh Factory. Mm-hmm. Because I do stand-up, too, and it was so funny because he didn't know that I was there. So he played a trick on me. I got booked to be on his show, and I walk into the club. I was supposed to go on like 4th or 5th. So I got there early to make sure, I wanted to check out the room and just chill a little bit, relax before I go on stage. Right. And as I come in, he's on stage already, and he's talking to the audience, and he's telling them about tonight's show. And he says, we got a great show for you tonight. And he starts to read off the names, and he gets to my name, and he goes, Jeffrey Gurian. He goes, is Jeffrey Gurian here? So I couldn't not say that I wasn't there. So I had to answer. I'm like, yeah, I'm here. And he goes, well, we're not going to wait. Come up on stage right now. Jeffrey Gurian's here. Come up on. And so, I didn't even have a chance to get nervous. I was supposed to go on like 5th, and he's bringing me right up. And it went great, and it was fine. But I had brought a friend of mine to film the thing. I barely had time to take the camera out because as soon as I got in, he introduced me. And it's the kind of show where you do your set, and then he interviews you while you're on stage.
Right.
Oh, okay.
You sit down with him on the stage. And we had a blast. He's just a funny, funny guy.
I think we see that on your webpage, the comedy.
Yeah, it's somewhere. I definitely have it posted somewhere. Yeah, he's like, yo, I always get a kick out of you, And it was a surprise because I was out there. I think I was out there doing Kroll show. Mm-hmm. And I've been on a few times already. And that guy, Nick Kroll, is a genius. Mm-hmm. He is a comic genius, and I don't use that word lightly, but when he does so many characters, and he does them flawlessly. It's really amazing to me to watch him work. So I was out there doing Kroll show, and I got a chance to do some of the clubs while I was out there, the Comedy Store and the Improv and the Laugh Factory. I made the rounds.
Those are legendary clubs.
Yeah, and, and I called the people, and I'm like, I'm in town, can I get a couple of sets here and there? And it was cool. I got to do that. And I was also promoting my book at the time, this was last year. So my book came out, a book that I did with Chris Rock, who wrote an amazing opening for me. He wrote the introduction. Mm-hmm. And it's called Make 'Em Laugh. See, I even fit in a plug for my own book. How's that?
If it wasn't going to be you, it was going to be us anyway. So, yeah, tell us.
Well, I was very excited about it. It's a book on what made me think of it was because you said legendary clubs. And in New York City, the very first comedy club ever was the Improv.
Right.
Which Bud Friedman opened in 1963, and it just celebrated its 50th anniversary. They did a big thing at the Just for Laughs Festival last year, and I'm sure all your listeners are familiar with Just for Laughs. It's the biggest comedy festival in the world, and it's in Montreal every year.
Yep.
We're already planning. I'm going up. I go up every year, so this year it will be no exception. It's at the end of July. I usually go up. Well, it covers a few weeks, but I go up for the last weekend.
Okay.
Which is really a really fun weekend. And so I interrupted myself and I lost my train of thought. Oh, we were talking about legendary comedy clubs. Yeah. So Bud Friedman opened the Improv originally as a coffee house. And the purpose of it was for Broadway performers to come by after they got off stage, and they'd come and hang out and maybe do a couple of songs or do a monologue or something like that. And then comedians started to come to the club. And after he was open a year or two, he said he had no experience in the entertainment business at all, but he noticed that more people were coming for comedians. And after a couple of years, he turned it into the world's first comedy club. It was a club strictly dedicated to comedians. Before that, there were always comedians, but they would perform in nightclubs, different venues, never a real comedy club. So that started, and in New York, he opened that up in 1963. And it wasn't until the end of 1972 that a guy named Rick Newman opened a club called Catch a Rising Star. And that was the second big club in New York. And a few years later, on June 1st of 1976, a guy named Richie Tinkin, who discovered Eddie Murphy and Chris Rock, how's that for your resume, to put on your resume, he opened the Comic Strip. And to this day, that's the only club that's still open from those days. The Improv in New York closed a long time ago. It exists in California. Catch a Rising Star closed in New York a long time ago. There are franchises around the United States called Catch a Rising Star, but not the original one. Rick now has a new place, a theater on the West Side where he's doing comedy and sketches and entertainment in general. He has a thing called Celebrity Autobiography. But the only club that's still open from 1976 is the Comic Strip.
Is the Strip.
Yeah, and that's the club I did the book on because I was fascinated by the club and how they managed to be open all these years and launch the careers of so many big stars. It was Jerry Seinfeld's home club because the club opened June 1st and Jerry came in on June 17th, 1976 to audition. And in the book, we have a copy of his original audition sheet. In those days, when you came in, they would grade you as to how you did.
Right.
Okay.
So Seinfeld got a good. They said he was good. Can you believe that? It's written right on there, good, and it said definitely invite back Monday, May 21st.
Wow.
So
did George Wallace start at the same time as him?
Not the same night, but yes, he started at the same time. As a matter of fact, George came in before the club was finished being built.
Okay.
George was selling advertising because that's what his business was.
Okay.
And he went on to become Jerry Seinfeld's roommate.
Right.
They were best friends for many years. But when he came in, he actually sold Richie bus advertising, so that on the back of every bus that went up First Avenue and down Second Avenue, because the club is on Second Avenue in Manhattan, and these are like major avenues that run all the way through Manhattan. The buses would say on the back, "Eat, drink, and laugh at the Comic Strip." That was the logo of the club in those days, and actually that was what we were going to call the book. The book was originally titled "Eat, Drink, and Laugh."
Okay.
But the publisher felt that it would be better to call it "Make 'em Laugh."
Make 'em laugh.
And when you're trying to sell a book, you do whatever the publisher tells you to do. It doesn't make sense to stand up for what you believe in because you're not going to get anywhere. So we changed it to "Make 'em Laugh." the history of the greatest comedy club, I think, of all time. And when Bud Friedman saw that book, he threw it on the floor. And you could see that in one of my interviews, too. It was funny. He was kidding around.
Right.
Last year, he was honored. He and his partner, Mark Lanau, were honored at the Just for Laughs Festival for their 50th anniversary of the Improv. And I was on the red carpet interviewing, them, and Amy Poehler was there. She got the award for the Comedy Person of the Year. Yeah. Nick Kroll got the award for the Breakout Star of the Year. So I was on the red carpet interviewing them, and when he came by, he saw my book. He took my book, looked at it, and threw it on the floor. He said, "The greatest comedy club of all time, huh?" I said, "Well, except for the Improv, I said, But he's a really fun guy, and it's amazing that he literally changed the world of entertainment by opening that club.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So my book took 4 years to do. It was a very labor-intensive process, and I interviewed everybody: Jerry Seinfeld, Ray Romano, Paul Reiser, Gilbert Gottfried, Susie Essman, Colin Quinn, Paul Provenza, Jackie the Joke Man, Louis Black, Judah Friedlander, Larry Miller, George Wallace, Jeffrey Ross, Jim Brewer, just on and on. Lisa Lampanelli, Adam Ferrara. All the stars that came out of there told their stories of how they got started at the Strip. Mm-hmm. And then I went out to L.A. to interview Billy Crystal.
Mm-hmm. Tremendous.
And that was a trip. That was really a trip to get to sit down with Billy. Mm-hmm. I hadn't seen him for many years, and as a matter of fact, there's a picture of us where he's pointing to his teeth because he remembered my background.
That's right. Yeah, there is that picture on.
He heard that rumor as well. That rumor really got around.
It follows you everywhere.
Well, what was funny was that Jack Rollins, I don't know, are you familiar with the name Jack Rollins?
I heard it, but not...
Woody Allen's manager. He's 97 years old, I believe. And if you look at the end of every Woody Allen movie, it'll say produced by Rollins and Jaffe.
Okay.
Jack Rollins and Charlie Jaffe were one of the most powerful managers in the entertainment business. And in those days, they were handling Woody Allen, Robin Williams, and Billy Crystal, among others.
Wow. Lineup. The powerhouse.
Yeah, amazing. And Jack had he thought it would be a good idea to do a sitcom about a dentist who was in show business, based on my story. Yeah. And he thought that Billy Crystal would be good to play me. Uh-huh. So that's how I originally met Billy back in those days at Jack's office. He introduced us. And I hadn't seen him in many, many years. I had seen him intermittently before when they dedicated a bar at the Friars Club to him, the Billy Crystal Bar.
Oh, wow.
And I saw him in those years, and that was maybe, 10 years ago, but I hadn't seen him in a long time. So it was really cool. In the middle of me interviewing him, he remembered. And he said, "Wait a minute, you're the funny dentist, aren't you?" And I'm like, I hate that, but I will admit to it, And he said, "Yeah, Alan King used to call you that." And I was like, "Wow, well, if Alan King called me that, then it's okay." Talk about another legend, Alan King. Yeah. So I flew out to L.A. to do Billy Crystal, and that was great. We had a blast. And it took 3 years to do all of the interviews because even when these people want to do a book, their schedules are so difficult. It's very hard to get them all, Mm-hmm. So the first 3 I did in Montreal when I was up at the Just for Laughs Festival. Larry Miller was the very first one I interviewed, and then George Wallace, and then Paul Provenza. They were all up there doing shows, so it was a good opportunity for me to kick the book off and get it started. And then one of the other reasons that it took so long was because I transcribed every single word by myself.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I taped every single interview, and they would go on for more than an hour sometimes,
Sure.
Jackie Martling's was 2 hours. He has a lot of stories, Jackie the Joke Man.
Yeah.
So his was 2 hours, and then when you play it back, I don't know if you've ever had to transcribe anything, but you could kill yourself. It's It's unbelievable because you have to keep going over it, like every sentence. You play it over and over again to make sure that you get every word right. Mm-hmm. And when people are having a conversation, they don't often stick to the topic. Very often they go off on a tangent.
Yeah, that's
just like I'm doing with you guys. You ask me one question and I wind up in Europe.
It's all good. It's all good.
No, it's like one thought leads you to another thought.
Yeah,
so if you were transcribing this, you'd go out of your mind. It's like I asked him this, and now he's talking about this, and then he's leading into this, and so you have to make sense of that when you're writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
You can't write half a sentence and then switch to another topic. And you also can't call everyone back 1,000,000 times and be like, what did you mean here? What was the point of this statement? They're not even going to remember what they said.
Yeah.
So I had to fill in parts, and being a comedy writer, it helps, because when you're a comedy writer, you learn to think in the mind of the person that you're writing for.
Mm-hmm.
You have to speak in their voice.
Right.
So that's what happened. I had to fill in stuff, and it took 3 years to do all the interviews and to transcribe all the interviews. That took a very long time. And then it took a year to edit, because after I got all that done, I had 500 pages.
Wow.
And the publisher only wanted 2 pages. No, I'm only kidding. The publisher wanted 250 pages. So I had to cut out half the book, which
so
was crazy, because how do you cut out stories from Gilbert Gottfried and Jerry Seinfeld? Well, actually, Gilbert Gottfried's was easy because the entire interview, he insisted that he had never been at the club. It was the most fun interview that I ever did because he has always been my favorite, and I got to sit with him and riff back and forth, asking him questions, and Richie was getting nauseous because he was paying for lunch, Gilbert insisted on being taken to a restaurant. He was the only one who did. And where did he pick? He picks one of the noisiest restaurants in Manhattan. So how are you supposed to interview someone in a noisy... People are screaming. They're screaming, and I'm supposed to be doing an interview, and it's in a part of town where there's no parking, so Richie had to pay for parking, which in New York is like $50 to park for like an hour. And then he's paying for lunch, and Gilbert is insisting that he had never been at the club. He did say he heard of it. He said, and one time he stood outside where he heard that they were going to build the club, so he stood outside waiting for it to be built, and that he heard that when it was built that it had good electricity. And then he went on to say that he heard that they had one chair, and the comics took turns sitting in that chair. Oh, so needless to say, it was like a really fun interview. Richie was getting nauseous because I couldn't get him to say one thing about the club. The whole interview was complete denial that he had ever seen or been there. And I wish you could have seen the look on Richie's face. It was amazing. So that was a really fun interview. And then, I got such, great stories from people,
mm-hmm.
Jim Gaffigan told stories that he got stage fright for about 6 years.
Really?
So physical stage fright to the point where he would become physically ill.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, and for the first 6 years, the only credit he had was that Dave Attell once told him he was funny. And I was like, serious? He goes, yeah. I go, so Attell was a fan of yours? He goes, well, if you know Attell, you couldn't possibly classify him as a fan. He wouldn't actually go that far as that, but he did say that I was funny. And then he used that. Colin Quinn was a bartender
mm-hmm.
at the comic strip who had to quit his job in order to become a comedian. Because in those days, you weren't allowed to work and perform at the club.
Mm-hmm.
Because Richie felt like if you wouldn't pay attention to your job if you were thinking about going on stage.
Right.
So everybody was telling Colin that he was so funny, so he quit his job as a bartender so he could start performing.
Wow.
And then, I don't know if you know the story about Ray Romano.
No.
Do you know? that he started performing under a different name. Mm-hmm. For the first few months of his career, he performed under the name Jamie Roberts.
Really?
Yeah, and the reason that he did that was because he had gone to the Improv first to audition. The Improv was still open then, and in those days, there was a lottery. A lot of the clubs had lotteries. Because so many people wanted to perform, they would have a lottery where they would pick numbers. And if they picked your number, you got a chance to go up that night. Because when the clubs opened like Catch a Rising Star or the Strip, there would literally be lines around the block of people who wanted to audition. Mm-hmm. So Ray knew that only like the first 6 or 10 numbers would get up to go on stage. So to double his chances, he decided he was going to bring a friend with him who would also fill out a slip, and they'd pick a number. The problem was he couldn't find a guy to go with him. He had to bring a girl with him.
Oh, okay. So
he says to the girl, listen, you got to write down a different name. I can't go up under a girl's name. So she puts down Jackie Roberts. Right? That's the name she picks, Jackie Roberts. So sure enough, who do they pick? Jackie Roberts. So he has to go up on stage that night as Jackie Roberts. He does well enough to pass the audition. Uh-huh. And now he has to say Jackie Roberts because he couldn't tell them he lied about his name. He was afraid to tell Silver Friedman, that was Bud's wife who was running the New York club. He was afraid to tell her that he lied. So for the first 3 months of his career, he was Jackie Roberts. And he said that one night he bombed. And he had never done that before. He said that up until then, it was like kind of beginner's luck. So he said after he bombed, he lost his nerve to go back on stage. And he didn't go back on stage for about 2 years.
Really?
Wow. Yeah, he went back to selling futons. His best friend was in the futon business.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, it was an episode on Everybody Loves Raymond about him selling futons. He actually sold the futon to Larry David.
Oh, my God.
Isn't that funny that he wound up in Larry David's apartment and he said, typical of Larry David, he wasn't happy with it and made him take it back.
I'm surprised, yeah.
How cool is that, right? Isn't that funny? And then years later, they wind up with their own shows. But that's what happened. And then, so after 2 years, he decided he couldn't take it anymore. He had to come back and do comedy again because once comedy is in your system, it's like a drug. And you can only suppress it for so long. Mm-hmm. And then after that, you got to do it, you know. So he came back to comedy, but he came back to the comic strip. And he killed off Jackie Roberts. Mm-hmm. And he came back as Ray Romano. And that's where his career got started. And that's where he met his manager, Rory Rosegarten, who've been together all these years and are still together to this day. Mm-hmm. Which is a very rare circumstance that people stay with their management so many years.
The one story I love is the Chris Rock story with the Eddie Murphy story.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. You know, at the time, Eddie was the biggest star in the world. He was like the Elvis of the comedy world. Mm-hmm. You know, he would wear leather. Richie was the one who suggested to him to wear leather. You
really?
know? Yeah, and he would wear leather suits, and he would pull up in these exotic cars with his entourage. And so whenever he would come to the comic strip, people would be very excited. The audience would go crazy because Eddie Murphy was there. And, you know, he had already done Beverly Hills Cop 1. Mm-hmm. This was in 1986, I guess. And so he comes in one night, and Richie's there, and a guy named Lucian Hold, who was running the club. When Eddie became a big star, Richie spent a lot of time in Los Angeles with him, so he needed somebody to run the club. And there was a guy named Lucian Hold who had been a carpenter who originally helped to physically build the club.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And when he was finished with building the club, Richie said, well, what are you going to do now? And he said, I guess I'm going to go back to Broadway and find a job as a dancer, because he had also been a Broadway dancer. Right? Broadway dancer and carpenter. Yeah. That's a great combination. That's as weird as being a dentist and a comedy writer. almost as weird as that.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything as weird as that. So he says, well, why don't you stay here and become a bartender? So he says, well, I don't know how to be a bartender. So Richie says, well, someone asks you for a beer, you give them a beer. Now you're a bartender. So he wound up staying. He wound up being there for 25 years, and he ran the club, and people used to think that he owned the club. He was literally the face of the club for 25 years. And it was up to Lucian who would perform. He would have to pass you in order for you to perform at the club.
Mm-hmm.
So this night, Eddie Murphy comes in, and he says to Richie and Lucian, he goes, are there any black comics I can see?
Mm-hmm.
Now, interestingly enough, in those days, there were hardly any black comics. There was a handful of black comics in those days, as opposed to today when there are hardly any white comics. There's there are so many black comics these days, but in those days, it really was not common. The only one that was there was Chris Rock, and he was 19 years old, and he was setting up chairs in exchange for stage time. That was his deal.
Wow.
That he would set up the chairs and clean up the place, whatever, and then they'd let him perform. But he would go on what was called late night. In those days, late night meant you'd go on at 2 or 3 in the morning for whoever was there, which was a bit like 6 drunks would be there, and that would be your audience, and he was happy to do that. So he had never performed before to a big audience. Now this was like a Friday night, and the place was packed, and it holds over 200 people. So Richie didn't want Eddie to leave, so they're like, let's give this kid a shot. So they put Chris Rock on stage. Chris knows that Eddie's there. Eddie is his idol. So just imagine how you feel knowing that you're going to perform for your idol. Mm-hmm. And the first time you go up on stage to a packed crowd on a weekend, and he totally killed it.
He kills, yeah.
Now, the way Chris tells me the story, he goes, I didn't do that great. He said, other guys were much funnier than me. I'm like, well, obviously you did well enough that Eddie liked you, because he said he heard Eddie laughing from the side, because he had such a distinctive laugh, you know?
Right.
So Eddie was waiting for him when he got off stage, and they sat in this little window seat surrounded by Eddie's entourage and his bodyguard and all. And at the end of that evening, Eddie gave him his phone number. And Chris said, he was talking to me like I was already famous. Like he's telling me what kind of house to buy for my mother. He goes, I never even had a shrimp cocktail. He goes, my father used to buy 1 shrimp and cut it into 7 pieces. He said, that's how poor we were. He lived in Bed-Stuy,
right,
which is a very rundown area of Brooklyn. These days it's probably nicer because of gentrification. Mm-hmm. A lot of white people are living in Bed-Stuy these days, and the area has changed all. But in those days, it was not good. And he, so Eddie gives him his number, and word got out through the comedy community that Eddie Murphy liked Chris Rock, right? So a couple of days later, Chris is walking in the street, and he runs into a guy named Louis Ferranda. Now, these days, Louis runs Caroline's Comedy Club, which is another huge, beautiful comedy club in Manhattan. But in those days, he was the bartender at Catch a Rising Star. Mm. So he sees Chris, and he's like, hey, I heard Eddie Murphy likes you. He goes, yeah, man, he gave me his number. So, Louis is like, well, did you call him? He's like, no, man, I'm too nervous to call him. And Louis is like, schmuck, if Eddie Murphy gives you his number, call the guy. What, are you crazy? So he called him that day, and Eddie invited him to go to the movies with him that night.
Yeah.
And he said he went, Eddie's whole entourage came, Eddie's mother was part of the group, and he said they went to see Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Mm-hmm. He said, and to show you how long ago it was, he goes, Spike Lee was out in the street selling T-shirts.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that evening, Eddie invited him to come to Los Angeles. He said he was doing reshoots for the movie Golden Child.
Okay.
So I'm like, well, did you go? He's like, I didn't have any clothes. He goes, I had never been on a plane. I had never been in a hotel. That's when he told me the shrimp cocktail line. He had, there were 7 brothers in the Rock family and 1 sister. Mm-hmm. Tony is in comedy, and now their little brother Jordan is also in comedy. But so I said, well, what happened? Did you go? He goes, yeah, I went. I borrowed clothes from my brothers. And I went on the plane, and they put him in this hotel called L'Hermitage, very fancy hotel in Los Angeles. Richie noticed that Chris was not eating. Mm-hmm. He's like, Chris, what's up? He goes, I can't afford $16 for a hamburger. He's like, well, you're not paying for this. This is on Paramount. Eddie's taking care of this. He goes, order whatever you want.
Yeah.
And so while he was out there, they offered him a part in Beverly Hills Cop 2. They created that part for him where he played a valet in Beverly Hills Cop 2.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what made his career. And Richie tells me the story. He goes, like, they were on the Paramount lot. He goes, as he recalls this, there was a long corridor. And as Chris was leaving, he was watching Chris walk down this corridor to leave. And Chris turned around and he goes, hey, Rich. And Richie's like, what's up? And he's like, don't forget me, man. And Richie's like, I'll never forget you. And he called the club and he told Lucian, when Chris Rock comes back, make sure you put him on early. Give him 9 and 10 o'clock spots, which are the ideal spots.
Right.
You know, Seinfeld always said the ideal spot was, I think, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock on a Saturday night at the comic strip.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of spots they gave him, and that's why Chris has been grateful to this day, and that's why he wrote such a funny introduction to the book.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a long story, but that's a fun story, right?
It is.
It's amazing to hear how all you comics hustled to get where you are.
Man, it's such a hard thing. In any other field, you go to school, you get a degree, and there's a reasonable chance that you're going to get a job in your field.
Right.
But in comedy, so much of it is luck. You have to have the talent to back it up, but you got to be in the right place at the right time. Mm-hmm. I mean, Chris literally lived at the comic strip. Mm-hmm. He used to sleep there.
Huh.
He would just, and then, like, years later, if he had a car, he would sleep outside the club in the car. He was always there. And so what he said was, if you're always someplace, eventually you're going to catch a break.
That's true. Yeah. Wow.
Because he was just always there. And, so then, like, if someone canceled, they would say to him, you want to go up on stage? Because every once in a while, a comedian can't make it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, I mean, there's, like, this book is filled with stories. Like, Paul Reiser got the movie Diner by accident. He went out shopping for shoes and underwear. With this other guy, there was another comedian who was part of that group. Every January 1st, since the 1980s, for like 35 years or so, they meet for a New Year's brunch. Mm-hmm. You guys know about that?
I heard you tell the story, yeah.
Yeah, and it's Reiser and Seinfeld and a comic named Mark Schiff and Larry Miller.
Yep.
And there was a fifth guy named Michael Caine that most people don't know because he died very young.
Okay.
And he was their original group. And Paul Reiser went with Michael Caine to the audition for Diner because Michael was the one who was really going for the film.
Okay.
And Paul was sitting there waiting, and the director of the film came out and saw him, and he goes, you have a headshot with you? He goes, I'm not here for that. I'm looking for underwear. And he's like, well, you have an interesting look, and you come back tomorrow with a headshot. And he did. Michael Caine wound up not getting the part, and Paul Reiser got Diner.
Oh, man.
Isn't that amazing?
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and, there's just so many stories like that of, like, luck had so much to do with it. Synchronicity, being in the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm. You always have to be prepared.
Yeah, you always have to be prepared, and then you just have to know that you're being guided. There's, like, some spiritual forces at work. Mm-hmm. That just, like, magical things happen, and you have to be ready. You have to be aware, because if you're not aware, you miss opportunities.
Yeah, for sure. What's Seinfeld like? Because every time I see an interview of his, he's so cerebral. He's very methodical. Like between him and Larry David, it just the way they dissect life and just there's funny in that. And then they go in this. It just unfolds like layers and layers. So we had a great time when he came for the interview. It took a long time to set it up, but when he came in, we did most of the interviews at the strip itself.
because we felt that being in that environment would bring back memories.
Sure.
And it was true. Yeah, he did a great interview and very insightful, very open. And he stayed, he wasn't rushing off, which was great. Because a lot of times people, they're in a hurry. Their schedule doesn't allow them to hang out for such a long time. It was just a wonderful day. We took a lot of pictures, and he told funny stories, and it was really fantastic. I mean, it was just great. Every one of them was an experience. And he talked about how grateful he was. He goes, I feel like I was born in 1976 because that's when this club opened, and that's when my life began.
No kidding.
Yeah, that was one of his quotes, which was amazing. I feel like I was born in 1976. And, and then Paul Reiser remembered the story of how they got friendly, because originally they weren't that friendly. There was an awkwardness, because when Paul first got to the club, he was dating a comedian named Carol Leifer, who was a girl, by the way, which is a good fact to know. And she lives in California now, Carol Leifer. And he said, within a very short time, Jerry Seinfeld was dating Carol Leifer. And he never really knew how that happened. He said, here this guy was like, and it's so funny because Gilbert Gottfried used to imitate Jerry Seinfeld way before he was famous. I don't know if you know that Gilbert does great imitations of all comedians. Well, he does a great Seinfeld. And people would be like, why are you imitating Jerry Seinfeld? He's nobody. He's just a comic from the club, Yeah. But Gilbert would always do Seinfeld. And once Seinfeld kicked in, every comic was doing Seinfeld. Not just as an imitation, but their act sounded like Jerry Seinfeld.
Right.
Everybody tried to do that, So the night before New Year's Eve, I think it may have been 1979 or 1980, Paul walked over to Jerry, and he said, let's put this Carol thing behind us. And he put out his hand to shake hands with him, and they shook hands, and that was the start of their real friendship. And the next day they started that New Year's brunch, and it's going on all these years.
Wow. That's amazing.
And they always ask each other, how did it start? And no one remembered until he was doing that interview with me, and that story came to him. He goes, that's how it went down, that I walked over to Jerry and put out my hand and said, let's put this Carol thing behind us.
Now, I hate to bring this up. It is tragic, but I want to celebrate their work and their lives. You were good friends with Phil Hartman and Patrice O'Neill.
Yeah, those were two very special guys to me, One of the photos that I treasure is me and Phil sitting in my apartment at my piano, He was a super, super guy, very talented. I mean, so well respected in his field, by all his peers. And Phil was a big supporter of mine, and I got to work with him. The first time we worked together was for the Friars Roast of Chevy Chase. And that was back in 1990, I believe, because I was kind of the liaison between the older comics and the younger comics in the Friars Club. Because young comics had never done roasts, and I had been writing for the roasts since, 1980, maybe 79, know. And so I was assigned to work with the comedians to help them prepare to do the Chevy Chase roast. And Phil and I got along so well that we stayed friends, and that's where I got to meet Kevin Nealon and Dana Carvey and all, because they all performed at that roast. And Patrice O'Neill was a very special relationship to me. And I wound up being his co-host on the Black Phillip Show on Sirius XM.
Right.
We had a blast. Patrice was the kind of guy. We had a very special relationship. And as a matter of fact, his wife, Von DiCarlo, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I brought her on Sirius XM with me. I'm a regular with Ron and Fez on Sirius XM, and I get to bring on guests who I like, from the comedy world. And I love Von DiCarlo. She's great, and she's talented, and she's on that new BET-centric show, According to Him and Her, which is a dating show. And Patrice and I just had this interesting relationship. the Black Phillip show was about how to meet women, basically. A dating advice show.
Right.
So he considered himself like the Black Dr. Phil.
Right.
And if you followed his advice, you could be beaten unmercifully by women of every color. I could never say the things that he would say to women, and he could never say the things that I said.
Right.
And if you watch, I still have the episodes that we did, and he realized that I was on the level. He's like, Jeff, because callers would come in and be like, Jeff's full of shit. He doesn't mean that stuff he's saying. And Patrice would be like, no, he's real. He does mean that stuff.
Right.
And he lives that way. That's what he says. Because I was like a counterpoint to him. We both enjoyed meeting women, but we went at it in a completely different way.
Yeah.
And I just loved being on. Plus, he said I was the only white man he ever met who knew all the words to "Bitch Better Have My Money."
That's right.
Which happened to be the theme song on the show.
The show, right.
Yeah, he didn't know that I had always wanted to be a pimp, so
Yeah.
I knew all those songs like that. AMG 1991. That was my favorite song, and that was his theme song. Bitch Better Have My Money.
That's right. Actually,
So
I listened to
we got along famously, and we never said a bad word about each other. Like, a lot of comics feel like they have to put each other down when they're together. You see groups of comics, they're always making remarks about each other, like a mini roast. Like Milton Berle would say to Henny Youngman, "Nice suit, Youngman, who shines it for you?" He would say stuff like that, which would make me laugh hysterically because I loved those kind of old-time jokes. To me, that's just so funny. But it wasn't mean-spirited, But these days, guys feel the need to put each other down a lot,
Right. Right.
And Patrice could do that with the best of them.
Yep.
If you went up against Patrice, he'd cut your legs off, man, You wouldn't stand a chance against Patrice.
Yeah, exactly.
But he and I never had that kind of an interaction. And his wife validated that, at the funeral. She was kind enough. She was like, Patrice loved you, man. And I'm like, yeah, and I felt the same about him. We had this, we couldn't have been more dissimilar in all different ways. I said to him, you should walk out on stage holding me in your arms like an infant, He was just so big,
Yeah.
But the nicest guy in the world.
Yeah.
I just loved seeing him. When I saw him, I would just smile. He just made me smile. And I would bring girls on the show. I would always bring hot models on, And I would warn them before, Patrice is going to deconstruct you. He's going to,
sure.
He's going to break you down to take away your power. Just go with it, And it worked out great because the girls held their own, and it was always a lot of fun. Always a lot of fun. And I miss that guy a lot. And I have one of my proudest possessions is a phone call that he made to me that is on my website, which I'm going to plug, JeffreyGurian.com for your listeners.
Yep.
Are we on the air yet, by the way?
No, we're going to...
or was all of this just the warm-up?
We were just warming up, Jeff.
This is just the warm-up, right? We're going to start soon, though, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
because I have stories I want to tell you guys.
Absolutely.
He called me one night at 4 a.m. to tell me how much he enjoyed doing the show that we just did together. And he left this message for me. I'm glad I wasn't up to answer because I treasure this message from him. And he's like, dude, that was so funny, the show tonight. It was special, that energy. And he's like, I don't want to be presumptuous, he said, but I would like to do a show with you. And sadly, he passed away before we could do that. But just the thought that he would think that he would want to do a show, he and I together, was amazing to me. And I have that phone call on my website if people want to see it, JeffreyGurian.com. I'm just, I was blown away by him. He was a comedy philosopher. He had very well thought out things. He was not a misogynist. People like to say, well, he hated women and stuff. He didn't hate women at all. He loved women. He hated how weak men became under the power of women.
Right. That's true, yeah.
That's what offended him. That no matter how strong a guy was, he would be a little weakling under the power of women. Because that's what we do, you know. We do what we do, you know, and it's amazing. And that's what he would talk about, you know. And I would also talk about how men mistreat each other, how men don't respect each other, how a guy will walk over to you while you're with a girl and just try to compliment the girl that you're with. Like, you need him to tell you that your girl looks good, right? Like, I don't fucking need you to tell me. If she's with me, I know she looks good. She wouldn't be here if she didn't look good. I don't need your validation.
Right.
You know, this backhanded compliment that guys give you, you know. It's like, so we would talk about all that stuff on the air. And we had a blast.
Oh, yeah. Just to hear him, I love replaying the old Opie and Anthony spots, and I'll watch Elephant in the Room, you know, every so often.
I was at that taping, Elephant in the Room.
Oh, yeah?
I was there with him that night, went backstage, got to meet his mom, and Harris Stanton opened for him that night.
Okay.
I don't know if Harris is on the album, Elephant in the Room, but that was a very special night for Patrice. He wore his big pimp's hat that night.
Yeah,
I think he was wearing that red velvet jacket.
Yeah.
He had a great collection of jackets. He should have been driving that car that I was driving. That would have been perfect for him. And, yeah, that was an amazing night. And Opie and Anthony recently celebrated their 20th anniversary.
Yes.
And Ron Bennington from Ron and Fez was the host of that show at Caroline's that honored their 20th anniversary. So I was there for that, and that was very special. And everybody spoke kindly of Patrice. You know, Jim Norton was there because he's part of the show since 2000. You know, I interviewed Jimmy recently, and everybody had good stuff to say about Patrice. They miss him.
Yeah.
Bill Burr's another comic that speaks very highly of him. Mentions him quite a bit.
You know, Bill was in town. They did, what was it, a couple of months ago. Bill created this annual memorial for Patrice O'Neal.
Right.
And he flew in from L.A. to do it. And they had a little after party. I was at the event, which was incredible. And there were so many people that performed. You know, Opie and Anthony opened the show. And, of course, Norton was there and performed, and Rich Voss and Bonnie McFarlane, and the whole crew, you know, from Opie and Anthony, and a bunch more comics whose names escape me for the moment. And then there was a big after party at The Stand, which is a cool comedy club in Manhattan, one of the newer clubs. The guys from Cringe Humor opened that. And there was a big party, and Don DeCarlo came, and Patrice's mom was there. And it's the second annual memorial, and Bill plans to do it every year. So that's really special when you can get that many people. And the place was packed. It was at a place called City Center. There must be a couple of thousand people there at least.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, it was great. It was really a great tribute to him. And, you know, it's nice to see that people aren't forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. He's missed. You know, he's just someone you want to ache to hear for, you know. So.
And we used to talk about a lot of stuff on the air. He would ask me about my inventions. You know about my inventions, right?
The stuttering?
Yeah, I know.
Oh, no, well, that's a whole other thing. But I invented the flashlight that works during the day. Now, well,
the flashlight?
Thanks to me, people can see where they're going during the day now, too. It never made sense that you could only see where you're going at night. Why should you only have a flashlight at night? So I came up with the flashlight that works during the day. Changed people's lives. I invented the 24-hour stapler. Now, I don't know if you have it in Canada, but I'm sure you've probably awakened at midnight and you're really in the mood to staple something, and your stapler stopped working at midnight. Not anymore.
Yeah.
Not anymore. I invented the 24-hour stapler. You can now staple to your heart's content. You could stay up all night stapling if you want to, thanks to the hard work that I put. I love inventing things.
Oh,
I invented the battery-operated beard. Now, I don't know if it got to Canada yet, but the big thing in New York these days is a lot of hot models like dating guys with biblical length beards.
Oh, the hipsters.
No, not the hipsters. Those are like Civil War beards. I'm talking about Methuselah kind of beards, the kind of beards that go down below your knees and that swing. See, they have to swing. Now, years ago, you'd have to plug in your beard in order to get it to swing. So if a guy went to a party and he saw a girl that he liked on the other side of the room, he'd have to first look for an outlet. Then he'd have to plug in his beard. He'd have to bring an extension cord. Now, if it was like a packed party, the dance floor would be covered with extension cords. People would be tripping all over the place. It was horrible. It ruined a lot of parties. I came up with the battery-operated beard, which eliminated completely all those problems. Now your beard could swing for hours, and you don't need any kind of an outlet or anything like that. It's revolutionized socializing in Manhattan.
What would we do without your insight?
Unbelievable. Well, that's how I spend my spare time. And I just got back from the Pinch Festival, where people come from all over the world to pinch each other. Which was another. That's how I spend my spare. You have to do something in your spare time, right?
Sleep?
And I invent sports. The sport of biggling. That's mine.
Uh-huh.
Has that gotten to Canada yet? Where people come up to you and say, "Would you care to biggle?"
What is that?
I don't think so.
Well, there are two teams, and one guy stands up it's like a home plate, and he's holding a ball. And there's another guy who stands about 30 feet away, and he throws a bat at him. And the guy swings the ball, and he tries to hit the bat with it. And it's called biggling. And you don't keep score. It's a very politically correct sport, because when you keep score, then some kids have to lose, and we want them to feel bad about losing. So no one loses in biggling.
Oh, tremendous.
It's a politically correct sport. So that's what I do with my spare time. I invent things. I create sports. I do a whole lot of stuff. And
yes, you do. You're very busy.
Very busy. And then I work with stutterers. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I'm always grateful for the opportunity to talk about that, because I'm sure that there's someone listening to your show who either does stutter or knows somebody who stutters.
A good friend of mine stutters very, very badly, actually.
Well, wait till he hears you talking about him on the radio.
That's not going to help.
Your ex-friend, right. No, embarrassing him on the radio. No, but, it's a terrible affliction, and people make fun of it, and it's a horrible thing. And I stuttered very badly until I was in my 20s. And my parents had sent me to speech class, and no one seemed able to help me. And I was determined that I was not going to go through the rest of my life as a stutterer. And I worked on myself for about 3 years. It took a long time. I was literally obsessed with stopping stuttering. But I realized one day that if I was in a room by myself, I didn't stutter. And that's true for a lot of stutterers. So they only stutter when they're trying to talk to somebody else. If they went into a room alone, they could say every word that was hard for them to say without stuttering. Like, I couldn't say Gurian for anything. Most stutterers can't say their own names. And what makes sense to me is because your name is your identity. And if you're not happy with who you are, you can't really put that out to the world. So every time I try to say my name, I would stutter. And I remember that when I went to college, I made myself run for the president of the freshman class. I went to a very big college. It was kids from a lot of different high schools were all fed into this one college. And I was kind of popular in high school, even though I never knew it. I never really felt like part of. who feels comfortable in high school anyway, right? I mean,
right.
If high school is the best time of your life, you should probably kill yourself, you know what I mean? Because there's not a lot going on in high school. No one really feels like they fit in, but there are always cliques. There's the jocks and the nerds and the cool kids, they think they're so cool, right?
Right.
Wait till you see those kids later. When you go to your high school reunion many years later, they don't look that cool anymore. So anyway, I ran for the president of my class, and I couldn't say my name. I had to have other kids that I called my campaign managers. They'd introduce me to other students. And I told myself that if I could win this election, I wouldn't have to stutter anymore because it would show me that people liked me. I think I had a sense that it had to do with my confidence and my self-esteem. And it was a great lesson for me because I won the election and I became president of the freshman class, and I still stuttered. And it taught me that outside validation in your life doesn't work. It doesn't matter how many people tell you that you're cool and fabulous and whatever. It matters what you think of yourself. Mm-hmm. So I started working on myself to build up my confidence and my self-esteem. And it took me a few years until I consider it grace. I was given the grace to figure out how to stop stuttering. And one of the things that I do is I work with stutterers. And I teach them how not to stutter. I teach them what I did so that they don't have to stutter. And the reason it's important to tell people is because stutterers need hope, because too many people tell them that they can't get better.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I'm here to tell you that you can. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of dedication, and not everyone has that obsession. A lot of times people learn about acceptance, and acceptance is cool. Acceptance is good for things that you can't change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If there are some things that we're born with that you cannot change, you must live with it, and acceptance is very important, or else you'll go crazy. But if I hadn't been given the grace to realize that I did not have to accept my stuttering because there was something I could do about it, I would still be stuttering today. Mm-hmm. And it's on my mind all the time. I listen to my voice constantly when I speak. I could theoretically start stuttering tomorrow, but I won't allow myself to. So if there are any people in your audience who do stutter, I suggest that they look at my website and read what it says about stuttering. If you go to my website, there's a lot of stuff there, but there's one menu part that says About. And if you bring down that menu, you'll see it talks about healing and it talks about headache therapy, because that's another specialty of mine, is curing headaches. Mm-hmm. But there's a whole thing about stuttering. And what I tell people is if you read that and it makes sense to you, then there's a good chance that my technique can help you. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to send me an email at jeffrey@jeffreygurian.com, and I'll be happy to answer it.
Tremendous.
I do all that myself. Excuse me?
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's something that's very important to me, and I'm always grateful to be able to put that out, because there are millions of people in the United States. There are about 3 million stutterers, I think. People really suffer with this thing, and a lot of times they don't go to school because of it. They don't get the jobs that they should have, and a lot of them have a lot to say, but they keep it in. It's tremendously frustrating, and it's so embarrassing when you can't speak. I remember very clearly being in high school and the teacher called on me, and I stood up, and not one word came out. Right. And I just stood there, and I just turned red until I sat down again, and I'll never forget how that felt, and it's a horrible thing. So I just like to get information out that if people, if they do stutter or they know somebody who stutters, that there is hope and that you can do that, because now I speak on radio, on TV. I'm always out there speaking, and I don't stutter anymore.
Exactly.
And so it's important for people to know that you can do something about it. Tomorrow I'm going to be on Ron and Fez. You guys get Ron and Fez, don't you, on Sirius XM?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's international. So, I'm bringing on tomorrow, I'm bringing on Steve Shariffa from The Sopranos.
Oh, really?
Bobby Bacala.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a great guy he is, I bring on special guests every week. I started with Colin Quinn, and I brought on Colin and Artie Lang and Russell Peters.
Oh, wow, yep.
Another Canadian hero, Russell Peters.
Absolutely.
How amazing is he?
I remember I saw Russell Peters at a smaller theater just outside of Toronto, Mississauga, I think the Living Arts Center.
Yeah.
And it's a couple hundred people, and then, years later, Air Canada Center.
Back-to-back shows.
like...
Is the Air Canada Center the one in Vancouver where 18,000 people showed up?
Yeah.
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 He did that 2 days
ago. Is that Vancouver?
No, it was Toronto.
Toronto's, Air Canada Center, I believe.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with that because when I asked him what his largest audience was, he said in Vancouver, whatever the venue was, 18,000 people came out 2 nights in a row.
He did that in Toronto, too.
Yeah.
Really? You know how amazing that is?
Yeah.
There's a handful of comedians ever that were able to fill stadiums like that. Dice Clay did it. I think Eddie Murphy did it.
Mm-hmm.
Just a handful of people.
That's incredible.
Whoever did that. And he's another, I call him the Messiah of comedy. Because he brings everybody together. If you look at his audience, it's a multi-ethnic group of people.
Yeah.
And he's got everybody laughing at themselves and at each other.
Absolutely.
And that's the healing force of comedy. That's one of the things that I love about comedy, that it's an opportunity to bring people together. And that's one of the things that I hate about political correctness, because that is dividing people.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're fortunate enough to have here multiculturalism, and obviously in New York City, too, you have the same. So,
yeah, but there are still things that, comedians will make a simple joke, and suddenly everyone these days wants everyone to apologize.
Right, yeah.
There's a lot going on about that, and I think you need to examine where it's coming from. When Lisa Lampanelli gets up, she's coming from a place of love. She's not a hater.
Yeah.
Russell Peters is not making fun of people. He's noticing the differences and the similarities between people, and he can imitate every accent.
Yeah.
When did that become like a slam?
Right.
To imitate somebody's accent.
It's a tribute.
Yeah, and it's always been funny. These days people are offended. I brought on Yanis Pappas, who's Greek, and he does a Greek character. And he told me that he actually got death threats for doing this Mr. Panos thing. And I'm like, it's such a harmless, display. It's a real talent to be able to imitate the accent of your people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's true. People do speak that way. I don't see why people would be offended by that.
People shouldn't take themselves too seriously.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
People shouldn't take themselves too seriously.
Exactly. And that's the power of comedy that I love, the power to make everybody laugh at themselves. Self-deprecating humor. Comics do it. They make fun of themselves. Every comic has something to say about themselves.
Yeah.
And then people laugh at you. If people did that in real life, you'd feel horrible.
No matter how many times I hear it, I die laughing when you say you're Phil Spector and Elton John.
And Elton John, yeah, right. I mean, that's my opening line because, it's just funny. But if people said that to me in the street, some guy followed me on a cruise insisting that I was Elton John. Now, I never said that I was, but he said to my friend, "Is that who I think it is?" And my stupid friend said, "Yes." Without confirming it. So the guy was following me the whole time. And he walked up to me. I'm talking to some girl, and the guy comes over, and he's like, "Thank you for the red piano." Now, I didn't know the red piano was Elton John's thing. I thought the guy was a lunatic. I'm like, "What red piano?" And he didn't stop. So I just said, "Thank you. And then he wound up sending an expensive drink to my table, and I don't drink, and it was like $400. Oh. And when the guy found out I wasn't Elton John, he was pissed off that he thought I was misleading him. I'm like, "You're a moron. I never said I was Elton John. You said it. You made that up, and you're following me around, and stop following me." The guy didn't leave me alone for a minute. It was ridiculous. And this was a cruise. There was 500 guys and 1,500 girls, all from like Penthouse, Playboy, Maxim. It was a big.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was like what do you call it? A charity cruise to raise money for charity, and it was amazing, an amazing cruise. And this schmuck is following me around. "Are you who I think you are?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm me. I don't know who you think I am, the red piano." What a jerk. But it's a good line for me on stage, so I use it.
Just on the insult comic bit there, my wife and I have been watching Lisa Lampanelli through the roast, and her special, I think Take It Like a Man, is tremendous. And I find myself enjoying it so much. I'm like, I want you to make fun of me. I want you to make fun of me.
Exactly. That's what people do. They feel honored when someone who's like that makes fun of them.
Yeah.
Who picks them out. Like Susie Essman, wherever she goes, people want her to call them a fat fuck.
Right.
No matter where she goes, and she goes, yeah, that's something great to be known for. I take the credit for like coming up with that phrase because Larry David told her to improvise.
Right.
So she just started calling Jeff Garlin a fat fuck, and everybody loved it.
Can you tell us about the Friars Club and roasts? I mean, it seems to me that they created the roast.
They did, yeah. They created the roast. The Friars Club opened in 1904, and it was originally opened by a group of press agents, and then it became a comedians club. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the exact transition, but I'm pretty sure that Milton Berle was the one who actually founded the space where it is now. He bought it's a gorgeous mansion on 55th Street between Park and Madison Avenue. And it's a legendary club known for its charity work.
Right.
The Friars Foundation, and they started these roasts as a way of raising money. As a matter of fact, I have the new book. I can tell you if I look at it here, like it's a list of everybody that was ever roasted. Page 60, let me see. And they would take the biggest stars in show business, like Frank Sinatra and all.
Right.
And they would roast them. Let me see. Here's the Friars Club Celebrity Roast. The very first one was 1950. And I don't even know if you'd remember this guy, Sam Levinson. Did you ever hear of Sam Levinson?
No, not so much.
He had a show on TV. And then in 51 was Phil Silvers, who I know you knew, Sergeant Bilko.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
From the old TV shows, Sergeant Bilko. In 1953, Milton Berle. Now, Milton Berle was my sponsor in the Friars Club.
Oh, really?
Which was a tremendous honor to me.
Wow.
Yeah, to have actually Milton Berle. Every time I was on the phone with him, I'd be like, holy shit, I'm on the phone with Milton Berle. I couldn't believe it. Mm-hmm. The whole time I knew him, I couldn't believe it, In 1954, Red Buttons. In 1956, Sammy Davis Jr. Wow. Yeah. So they used to do these roasts, and they were always secret. And in those days, women were not allowed in the club. It was strictly a men's club.
Right.
Until Gloria Allred sued. I don't remember what year that was, but one of the first women there was Phyllis Diller, who snuck into the club dressed as a man.
Wow.
And the joke was that no one noticed. And I remember seeing her. I was there at that roast. I think she was wearing a tuxedo, and it was obvious that she was a woman in a tuxedo, but no one noticed, And so the Friars Club had always done these roasts, and then years later, then Dean Martin picked up on it and did the Dean Martin roasts, which were clean for television. Mm-hmm. And then in recent years, they had a deal with Comedy Central where they showed the roast to the public.
Right.
Which had never been done before. You were never allowed to, to tape the roast or do anything like that, So I wrote for the roasts, and from 1978 to 1990, there was a guy named Bob Sachs who was the producer of the roasts, and I was his personal writer. So I got to write for all those roasts, and I got to write for the people who were being honored, like Jerry Lewis and Bruce Willis, and, who's that famous, Rich Little? Right. And Chuck Scarborough, who's a news anchor. I don't know if you know him in Canada. Chuck Scarborough is on NBC. But I got to write for the roasters and the roastees. And that was an amazing experience for me, sitting around with those guys writing filth.
Yeah. So
pure, unadulterated filth.
Every year? Once a year, I suppose?
Once a year it was. Some years in those days they did 2 in 1 year. But in recent years, they started doing just 1 a year because it's a huge deal. And it's very hard to get people to commit a year in advance because they have to plan these things a year in advance. Mm-hmm. So in the last, since the year 2000, we did Rob Reiner in 2000, Hugh Hefner in 2001, Chevy Chase, who was roasted 2 or 3 times.
Right.
Donald Trump in 2004, Jerry Lewis again in 2006, Quentin Tarantino in 2010, and last year was Jack Black in 2013.
Wow.
So, they get these huge stars, but again, it's very hard to get them to commit a year in advance, and that's about how long it takes to plan one of these things. And then you got to get all their friends to make sure that they're going to be there. It's a huge, huge undertaking, but it's a wonderful club. It's an incredible place to be. If you love show business, you love being in the Friars Club because there's a George Burns room, a Milton Berle room. Downstairs is the Billy Crystal bar. And it's pictures of all these people, throughout show business history. It opened in 1904, it started, so that's 110 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a history.
Yeah. There must be an energy in that building.
Yeah, you can feel it when you walk in. I'm still in awe of it. I'll be there tomorrow night. Danny Aiello is showing a new film. He's in this Jack Ruby film.
Oh, wow.
So tomorrow afternoon I'll be on the radio with Steve Shariffa, and then tomorrow night I'll be at the Friars Club with Danny Aiello. So it's going to be a fun day.
Incredible. Yeah, you just live in a dream.
I get to do a lot of fun stuff. And then I get to go on shows like with you guys.
Yeah, this is tremendous. We can't thank you enough. We're really excited when we got the reply. So.
Well, me too. It's always fun to be on with people, and it's a lot better than sitting home and talking to myself. Because if I had just sat here at my desk for the last hour or so and told myself all these stories, it wouldn't have been as much fun.
It's nice to have great memories, but it's terrific to keep creating new ones, isn't it?
Yeah, to keep creating new ones and to share them with people who appreciate it.
That's right.
So, I'm assuming that you're going to let other people hear this, not just you two guys.
No.
Yeah.
You're going to allow other people to hear it.
For sure.
Absolutely.
And then they can hear the stories, too.
Live, unedited.
So, if people, I just want to mention my book again.
Yep.
Because if you love comedy, you'll love this book. It's called Make 'Em Laugh. And it's available on Amazon. You get it really cheap on Amazon. More easier than at the bookstores. Are there bookstores left in Canada?
Yeah, there are.
Because there's not that many in America. A lot of bookstores went out of business because of the internet.
Yeah, they really are heading up.
But we have Barnes & Noble. You guys have Barnes & Noble there?
We have Chapters in Indigo, which I think is a Barnes & Noble company.
Well, I'm sure it's available, but it's also available on Amazon.
Okay.
And, and if any of your listeners get it, please leave a comment. Amazon loves that when you leave a comment, especially if it's positive.
They love their reviews.
Yeah.
If you like the book, write something cool about it. And, and check it out. It's got great stories from all the comedians that you'd love. And come and join me on Sirius XM with Ron and Fez. I'm on all the time. I do promos throughout the week on what's happening in comedy in New York and L.A. and anywhere else I think is important. That's what they let me do. So I talk about all kinds of stuff coming up and who just released a CD and who's got what show. I'll be talking about John Mulaney tomorrow. He's got a new show coming out on Fox and called Mulaney. And he's amazing, too, John Mulaney, Such a funny guy. And Julie Klausner is writing his new show. So I'm going to be talking about all that stuff. Wow. And anyway, and if anybody wants to reach me, like I said, my email is jeffrey@jeffreygurian.com, and it'll be fun. I answer all my own stuff.
Yeah, we just love that. Let me just get you quickly your opinion on that too. Like staying connected via the internet, via Twitter, social media, YouTube, your videos. It's really helpful tools for comics nowadays too to create a following, maybe even before or while they're building their careers.
Yeah, and these days it's not only helpful, it's imperative. You can't really survive without that. Everybody, you have to send somebody a link. Nobody's handing anybody DVDs anymore. Like, I'll mail this to you. Well, it's so funny that I'm saying that to you because I co-produced a documentary film this year called The Business of Comedy. And it's featuring like Robert Klein and Susie Essman and George Wallace is in it, and it's about how hard it is to make a living in the comedy world.
Right.
But Friedman is in it, Rick Newman, Richie Tinkin, all of the major club owners, and so I'm sending it up to the Just for Laughs Festival to see whether they'll show it this summer.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no link for it. I had to mail them a DVD because the executive producers never created a link. I have to tell them they must have a link because people these days want a link. They don't want physical things. And so it's incredible. So, you know, I'm always doing videos. I was at the American Comedy Awards last week, and I shot 16 interviews that day on the red carpet. You know, I shoot all the red carpet stuff, and that's another thing. If your listeners like videos, I have over 300 of them with all your A-list favorites: Jimmy Fallon, Chelsea Handler, Jon Stewart, Seth Meyers, Nick Kroll, Amy Poehler, Seth Rogen. You know, NBC did the American Comedy Awards, which aired this past Thursday night. And when is this show going to air, by the way? Do you know?
We're going to try to get it out actually in just a couple hours. So.
Oh, cool. Oh, awesome.
Yep.
So this was just, you know, it just happened, the American Comedy Awards, and I got to interview Bill Cosby, which was special, you know.
Oh, yeah. Yep, I saw that.
And then about a week or so before, the Friars had a tribute, and Shecky Green came in, who's 88 years old, and Norm Crosby, who's 86. And I got to interview those guys. I hadn't seen them in a long time, you know. And so I get to do these really fun events and get to interview people. I was at the South Beach Comedy Festival earlier in April, down there with Mike Epps and Chelsea Handler. Mike Epps is amazing. I spoke to him today. He's on his way to Australia.
Oh, wow.
And he's going to be in New York on June 7th to be at Madison Square Garden.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I do. I have to keep on top of whatever's happening in the comedy world so I can talk about it and help put the word out and do my videos. So all my videos are on my channel, Comedy Matters. Well, it's actually on YouTube. If you go to youtube.com, you put in Gurian News Network, GNN, right? Gurian News Network, like on Kroll's show. He did GNN, which is all the news that's fit to dance to.
Right on.
which are the stories that I told you guys before. Like tap dancing for the criminally insane, and man paints replica of the Sistine Chapel with his beard. I do a lot of facial hair humor.
Yeah.
And schizophrenic man throws himself out of his own apartment. You know how hard that is to do? He had to sneak up behind himself and wrestle himself to the ground. He said, fortunately, he was strong enough and he got away. But you never know. It could go either way.
Oh, my gosh. Tremendous. Well, we'll certainly try to do our part to be ambassadors and, you know, kind of model after your work. That's why we started this show, so.
Well, that's great. It's important that you guys do what you do. You have shows, you put out positive energy to the universe. Very important.
We have the good fortune of having great guests, and we appreciate you, your work, and you know what? It's true. No one can say no to you, Jeffrey.
Who said that?
It's in the intro video.
Oh, Bob Saget said that. Yes, Bob Saget, that dear. I couldn't believe he said that. Yes, he said no one said no to me. So, and I didn't say no to you guys.
That's right.
That's how this world works.
We love the community, everybody helping each other. So,
absolutely.
To our listeners who, you know, obviously audio-wise, you can't see Jeffrey, but you can't miss him either. He's the pimp with the flowing hair, the glasses, the scarves, and colorful suits. So,
I'm assuming that you have internet in Toronto. So if you do that, then your listeners won't have to guess. They can just come to my site, ComedyMattersTV.com or JeffreyGurian.com. They both lead to the same place. Mm-hmm. And they'll see me, and then they can contact me.
Absolutely.
And that'll be so cool. Then I'll have friends in Toronto.
Absolutely. So when you get up here next, we're going to try to link up with you, or we'll try to make our way to the Just for Laughs Festival. How's that sound?
That sounds great, man. I look forward to seeing you in person.
And will you come back on the show with us?
Anytime you want.
Oh, tremendous. We can't thank you enough. All right, that was incredible. Jeffrey Gurian, the legend, the incomparable one. He knows so many friggin' people, eh?
Just name drop at everybody who's anybody. It's awesome, man.
And it's warranted.
Yeah, for sure. He's a lesson in how to hustle, though, eh?
Absolutely. That's what I was thinking. I'm like, you know what? Comedy's a hard gig, and if you can do even just a fraction of that, in your life, man.
He must be on Provigil. That guy goes on forever. He's got so much energy.
Absolutely.
Like, the whole time he was telling those stories, I'm like, God damn, I'd be so tired.
It's nice to accumulate that many stories and look back on your hard work. So thank you, Jeffrey Gurian. Check out his website, comedymatterstv.com. And don't forget to pick up Jeffrey's book, Make 'em Laugh, 35 Years of the Comic Strip, the greatest comedy club of all time. So terrific. Thanks for joining us, guys. We had a great time with Jeffrey, and we always have a great time with you. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter @RealNobodies, and visit our website, thenobodies.com. Subscribe on iTunes, and please, if you have a chance, give us a review and leave some ratings. iTunes really likes that, and it'll help our positioning on iTunes. So, signing off for Nelson at this time. Who does it better than us? Nobody. Big hug and little kiss. Good night, everyone.